18-year-old Alice Miller stood at the threshold of the church, her hands trembling at her sides, fingers digging into the folds of the plain dress her mother had forced onto her that morning. The dress itself was lovely, cream-colored, with lace at the sleeves, something meant for a joyful bride. But today it felt like a burial shroud. A firm hand gripped her arm. "You'll do this, Alice," her father's voice rasped low in her ear. "Don't think you'll embarrass me." Thomas Miller was a man without a backbone, but he had always held power over his daughter in the ways that mattered. His fingers dug into her flesh as he pushed her forward, the stink of cheap whiskey thick on his breath. Inside the church, Silas Grayson waited. He stood at the altar, broad-shouldered and towering, a man built by years of survival in the unforgiving frontier. His salt-and-pepper beard barely concealed the deep scars that ran along his jaw, and his dark eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted. Alice had seen him only once before, across the town square when he had shot a man for cheating him at cards. His presence alone had sucked the warmth from the air. Now he was to be her husband. The preacher, an aging man whose face was drawn, with worry, shifted uncomfortably. He had no more choice in this than Alice did. His eyes flickered toward the outlaw, then to Thomas, who gave him a sharp nod. "Let's get this over with," Grayson muttered, rolling his shoulders as though even this small moment of ceremony irritated him. Alice's feet felt like lead as she was dragged forward. Her mother stood in the pews, her hands clasped, her lips pressed tight to keep from trembling. Margaret Miller had begged Thomas not to do this. Alice knew it, but her mother was as powerless against him as she was. Thomas pushed her forward, one last time, and her hands landed against the rough wool of Grayson's coat. The outlaw's lips curled in amusement. "Eager, aren't you?" His voice was like gravel underfoot. Alice recoiled, but Grayson caught her wrist before she could retreat. The weight of his grip was crushing, unyielding. Now, little dove," he murmured. "No use resisting. You're mine now." The preacher's voice wavered as he began the vows, each word falling like the strike of a hammer, sealing her fate. Alice didn't hear them. Her heart pounded too loudly, and her vision blurred at the edges. "Do you, Alice Miller, take Silas Grayson to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The silence stretched. Her lips parted, but no words came. A sharp pain bloomed at her side. Her father's fingers pinching a warning into her ribs. The word felt like ash in her mouth. "I do." Grayson let out a chuckle, dark and knowing. The preacher hurried to finish. "And do you, Silas Grayson, take this woman—" "I do," he interrupted, before the question could even fully leave the preacher's lips. It was done. Heavy silence settled over the church before Grayson reached out, cupping Alice's chin. His thumb brushed over her cheek, not with affection, but possession. Now that wasn't so hard, was it? His lips crashed against hers, rough and demanding. Alice's hands clenched into fists, but she didn't push him away. She couldn't. When he pulled back, he turned to the gathered crowd and let out a bark of laughter. "Ain't she a beauty? You all best remember, she's mine now. Any man even thinks about touching her, he'll answer to me." No one spoke. No one ever did when Silas Grayson made a claim. The evening sun burned low as the church doors swung open, and Alice was led through the street toward the waiting horses. The town had seen its share of tragedies, but none quite like this. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men stared at the ground. No one helped her. She was led to Grayson's horse, a massive black stallion that snorted and pawed the dirt. He swung up into the saddle with practiced ease, then reached down and hauled her up with him, as though she weighed nothing. The ride out of town was long and silent. Alice sat stiffly in front of him, her stomach twisting with nausea at the feel of his arm banded around her waist. The reins were in his other hand, but he didn't need them much. The horse knew the way, his breath was warm against her ear. "You're going to be a good wife, aren't you?" Alice didn't answer, a sharp tug at her waist. "I asked you. A question." "Yes," she forced out, hating the way her voice shook. Grayson chuckled again, but he didn't push further. They rode through the wilderness until they reached the hideout, an isolated camp built into the craggy hills, hidden from the law and anyone who might come looking. Alice had never been this far from town before. Here the world belonged to men like Grayson. The outlaws gathered as they rode in, filthy men with leering eyes. Some whistled, others just stared. Alice stared at the ground. Grayson dismounted first, then pulled her down after him. He kept his grip firm on her wrist as he led her into the main cabin. Inside, the space smelled of sweat, whiskey, and something more metallic. Blood. "This is home now," he said, pushing open a door at the end of the hall. The room was small, with a single bed, a chair, and a basin of water that looked weeks old. "Don't get any ideas about leaving. You wouldn't last a night out there." Alice didn't move. Grayson let out a slow breath and turned to face her fully. For a moment his expression shifted. Something resembling thoughtfulness crossed his face. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold smirk. "I know you hate me." He stepped closer, forcing her back against the wall. "But you'll learn to accept me, little dove. I always get what I want." Alice turned her face away, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Grayson exhaled through his nose, then laughed softly. "I'll give you tonight to settle in. But tomorrow? Tomorrow you start acting like my wife." With that he turned and left, shutting the door behind him. Alice stood frozen, barely breathing, barely thinking. Outside, the sound of drunken laughter and gunfire filled the night. Inside, she felt the walls closing in. She sank to the bed, staring at the wooden slats of the floor. This was her life now. A cage, locked tight with no key. But in the distance, past the towering pines, past the rolling hills, there was another shadow, moving through the dark. A hunter. A man with no allegiance to the law or to outlaws. A man who had come to kill Silas Grayson. And whether he knew it yet or not, he had also come to save her. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine through the trees as Ronan, White Fox, crouched at the ridgeline, his sharp gaze fixed on the outlaw camp below. A collection of cabins and makeshift tents sprawled across the valley, dimly lit by flickering lanterns and the glow of a central fire. Men laughed and shouted, their voices rough with whiskey, unaware of the predator watching from the shadows. Ronan had been trailing Silas Grayson for days, moving like a ghost through the wilderness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tonight, that moment had come. The camp was alive with celebration. Half the men were drunk, the others too distracted by gambling and women to notice the silent figure slipping between the trees. He adjusted the tomahawk at his hip and the knife strapped to his thigh, every motion deliberate, every breath controlled. He had killed men before, but this time was different. This time it was for a woman he had never met, Alice Miller. The name meant little to him beyond the promise he had made to her mother. But there was something about the situation that burned in his blood. He had seen women forced into lives they never chose. He had seen the look in their eyes, the silent, desperate plea for escape. No one had ever come for them. Tonight, someone would. Ronan moved like a shadow, slipping. Past the outer guards, the first man sat slumped against a barrel, his rifle across his lap, head nodding forward. Ronan drew his knife and stepped behind him, one hand clamping over the man's mouth as he drove the blade into his throat. The body jerked, then went. Still. He wiped the knife clean on the man's coat and moved on. Another guard leaned against the side of a cabin, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Ronan crept up behind him, wrapped an arm around his throat and wrenched back hard. The crack of vertebrae was swallowed by the wind. 2 down. The main cabin loomed ahead, larger than the others, its front porch lined with empty whiskey bottles. The men inside were too loud, their laughter carrying across the camp. Ronan ignored them. They weren't his concern. Only Grayson was. Slipping around the back of the cabin, Ronan pressed against the wooden wall, listening. A deep, gruff voice rumbled inside, followed by the soft murmur of another. A woman. Alice Ronan's grip tightened on his knife. He tested the door. Locked. No matter. He took a step back, lifted his boot, and drove it hard against the frame. The door crashed open. Grayson was already reaching for his gun when Ronan moved. The tomahawk flew through the air, burying itself in the outlaw's shoulder. Grayson let out a roar of pain, staggering back. Alice gasped, scrambling away from the bed, her wide eyes locked onto the scene before her. Ronan was on him in an instant. He drove his knife forward, but Grayson caught his wrist, twisting hard. The pain shot up Ronan's arm, but he didn't falter. He swung with his free hand, catching Grayson in the jaw. The older man stumbled, blood dripping from his shoulder, but he was still dangerous. A gunshot rang out. Ronan barely ducked in time. The bullet splintered the wall behind him. Grayson swung wildly, his strength fueled by rage. He tackled Ronan, sending them both crashing against the wooden floor. Fists flew, elbows landed, each man fighting for control. Ronan twisted, using the momentum to roll them over. He drove his knife downward, but Grayson caught his wrist again. The outlaw gritted his teeth, blood staining his lips. "You ain't killing me that easy, boy." Another gunshot. This time it wasn't Grayson who fired. The outlaw stiffened, his grip loosened. Ronan shoved him off, scrambling to his feet, his breath coming fast. He turned toward the source of the shot. Alice stood near the door, hands shaking, the small pistol still aimed at Grayson's chest. Smoke curled from the barrel. Her breath hitched, her eyes locked onto the man she had just shot. Grayson let out a choked laugh, blood seeping through his shirt. "Should have known that you had it in you," he rasped. Then, with a final breath, he slumped to the floor, unmoving. Silence filled the cabin. Alice's entire body trembled. The pistol slipped from her fingers, clattering against the wood. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had done it. She had killed him. Ronan watched her, his own heart still pounding from the fight. He hadn't expected that. He had come to end Grayson himself, but she had saved herself. A noise outside broke the silence, shouting, footsteps. The men had heard the shots. Ronan moved fast, grabbing Alice's arm. "We have to go now." She didn't argue. She let him pull her through the cabin, stepping over Grayson's body without looking down. The moment they stepped outside, the world erupted. Gunfire split the night as the outlaws realized what had happened. Ronan ducked low, pulling Alice with him as bullets whizzed past. The two nearest men raised their rifles. Ronan dropped one with a throwing knife before the shot could fire, then lunged at the second, taking him down with a quick, brutal strike. Alice barely had time to breathe before Ronan was pulling her, again dragging her toward the tree line. Shots rang out behind them, but the darkness was on their side. Ronan knew these woods. He had grown up learning how to move unseen. Within minutes, the campfire's glow was nothing but a flicker behind them, and the shouting voices faded into the wind. They ran until Alice could run no more. Her legs buckled, sending her collapsing to the damp earth. She gasped for breath, hands digging into the dirt. Ronan crouched beside her, listening. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant owls, the whisper of the wind, but no pursuit. Not yet. She lifted her head, her face pale in the moonlight. Is he really dead?" Ronan nodded. "He's dead." She exhaled, a sound between relief and disbelief. The reality was setting in. She was free. Her whole life she had been trapped, first by her father, then by Grayson. Now she belonged to no one. She looked up at Ronan, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" He hesitated. "Ronan White Fox." Her brows furrowed slightly. "Why did you do this?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected fear. Gratitude maybe, but not that. He considered his answer carefully. "Because someone had to." She held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. The wind shifted, carrying distant voices. The outlaws wouldn't give up so easily. Ronan rose to his feet, offering her a hand. "We need to keep moving." Alice hesitated only a second before taking it. He pulled her up, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless. There was no clear destination, no guarantee of safety. But for the first time in her life, Alice wasn't being led somewhere against her will. This time she was choosing to run. The forest closed around them, thick with shadows and the sounds of night. Alice stumbled over roots and slick earth, her breath ragged in her throat. The cold air burned her lungs, but she pressed on, gripping Ronan's hand as he guided her through the underbrush. Every few minutes, he would pause, listening. His posture was taut, every muscle poised for action. He didn't speak unless necessary, and she had no words to give him. Her world had been reduced to movement, to the feel of damp leaves beneath her fingers as she caught herself from falling, to the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. They had been running for what felt like hours, the outlaw camp long behind. Them. The scent of wood smoke had faded, replaced by pine and the rich dampness of the earth. A stream gurgled somewhere nearby, its whispering current the only sound beyond their own footfalls. At last, Ronan stopped. "This way," he murmured, leading her toward a thick copse of trees. Hidden among them was an overhang of rock, partially, enclosed by moss-covered boulders. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the elements. Alice collapsed onto the ground, her legs refusing to carry her any further. She hugged her arms around herself, shivering despite the exertion. Ronan knelt beside her, his face shadowed in the moonlight. "We stay here for now." Her breath came in gasps, her chest heaving. They'll come after us," he nodded. "They will, but they won't find us tonight." His confidence should have reassured her, but she could still hear the gunshots, the shouts, the sound of Silas Grayson's final breath. It replayed in her mind over and over, the weight of it pressing against her ribs. She had killed a man. The thought made her stomach churn. Ronan pulled a flint from his pack and struck it against a small pile of kindling. A spark caught, flickering, to life, casting trembling light against the rock. He coaxed it carefully, adding dried grass and twigs until a modest fire crackled between them. Alice held her hands toward the warmth, her fingers numb. Ronan watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You did what you had to," he said at last. She swallowed hard. "It doesn't feel that way." He reached into his satchel, pulled out a strip of dried meat, and offered it to her. She hesitated before taking it. The first bite was tough, but she barely tasted it. "You never killed before." It wasn't a question. She shook her head. Ronan tore off a piece of jerky with his teeth. "Most people don't, until the moment comes. Until they're standing at the edge, looking down, and they realize there's no other way." Alice stared at the flames, her hands curled in her lap. "He would have killed you." "Yes. I didn't even think, I just pulled the trigger." Ronan studied her for a long moment before he spoke again. "You think it makes you a bad person?" She didn't answer. He leaned back against the rock, stretching his legs out in front of him. "There are bad men in this world, Alice. Grayson was one of them." He met her gaze. "You're not." The words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She wanted to believe them, but she wasn't sure she could. The firelight cast flickering shadows across Ronan's face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone. He wasn't much older than her, maybe in his late 20s, but there was a weight to him, a quiet burden that he carried. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself. "Have you killed before?" His expression didn't change. "Yes." She waited, expecting more, but he didn't elaborate. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the leaves. Ronan stiffened, his head tilting slightly as he listened. He moved like a wolf, silent, deliberate. Alice held her breath, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. A moment passed, then another. Finally, he relaxed. Just the wind. Alice let out a shaky breath. She watched as he pulled a small pouch from his belt and opened it, revealing dried herbs. He dropped a handful into a tin cup, then poured water from his canteen. Holding the cup over the fire, he stirred the mixture with a twig. "What is that?" "Tea." She arched a brow. "You drink tea?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "It helps with wounds." It was then that she noticed the dark stain spreading beneath his shirt. "You're hurt." He waved her off. "It's not bad." "That's a lie." She sat forward. "Let me see." He hesitated before sighing and unbuttoning his shirt. The fabric peeled away from his skin, revealing a gash along his ribs where Grayson's knife had found him. The wound wasn't deep, but it bled sluggishly dark against his skin. Alice swallowed. "You need to clean it." "I will. Now." He huffed a quiet laugh, but handed her the tin cup. "Pour it over the cut." She did as he said, wincing as the tea soaked into the wound. He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Sorry." He shook his head. "You did fine." She reached for a strip of cloth from his satchel and pressed it gently against the wound, tying it as best she could. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alice leaned back, pulling her knees to her chest. "Where will we go?" Ronan stared into the fire. "West," she frowned. "That's not an answer." He smirked. "It's the only one I've got." She shook her head, exasperated. "You killed Silas Grayson. His men won't stop looking for you, for us." "I know," she let out a slow breath. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words sat heavy between them. Ronan shifted, resting, his arms on his knees. "You ever been beyond that town?" She shook her head. He stared into the fire as though seeing something far beyond the flames. "The world's bigger than you think." She wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort her or himself. The fire crackled, the warmth seeping into her bones. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was until now. Her limbs felt heavy, her eyelids drooping. Ronan watched her. "Sleep. You'll keep watch." He nodded. Despite everything, despite the terror, the blood, the chase, Alice felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. She let her eyes close. Ronan listened to her breathing as it slowed, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his knife. He knew better than to trust safety. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the hunt. The morning came with the scent of rain on the wind. Alice awoke to the sound of distant birds and the low crackle of dying embers. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then reality settled in. Her aching limbs, the damp chill in the air, and Ronan's quiet presence just beyond the fire. He stood at the edge of the trees, his back to her, watching the horizon. His posture was rigid, every inch of him coiled in anticipation. "They're coming, aren't they?" Alice's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Ronan didn't turn. "Yeah," she swallowed, her pulse quickening. "How many?" He exhaled, slowly. "Enough." She pulled the tattered blanket tighter around her shoulders, her mind racing. She had known this was coming. Silas Grayson had been a monster, but he had been a powerful one. Killing him hadn't erased his influence. His men would want revenge. Ronan finally faced her, his dark eyes scanning her expression. "You still have time to run." Alice's hands clenched into fists. "No." His jaw tightened. "If they catch you—" I said no. She pushed to her feet, ignoring the ache in her muscles. "I won't run." He studied her, searching. For weakness, for hesitation. When he found none, he nodded. The next few hours passed in silence. Ronan led her to higher ground, where thick brush and rocky outcroppings offered some cover. He handed her a rifle, an old, well-worn thing, but sturdy. "Do you know how to use it?" She hesitated, then shook her head. Ronan moved behind her, his arms steady as he guided her hands over the weapon. "You don't pull the trigger until you're sure." His voice was low, even. "You breathe. You wait." Alice tried to focus, but all she could hear was the echo of that night, her father's betrayal, Grayson's touch, the gunshot that had ended him. She tightened her grip on the rifle. A distant shout rang through the trees. Then another. "They found the tracks," Ronan murmured. "Won't be long now." Alice's pulse hammered in her ears. Minutes passed, stretched thin with tension. Then the first shot cracked through the silence. Ronan moved fast, shoving her into cover as a bullet slammed into the tree beside them. He rolled, drawing his own, weapon in a single fluid motion, and returned fire. A scream cut through the air. Alice clutched the rifle to her chest, breath coming in ragged gasps. This was real. The danger, the death, it was real. A second gunman appeared on the ridge, aiming for Ronan. Alice didn't think. She raised the rifle, just as he had taught her. She breathed. She waited. She fired. The man jerked backward, tumbling down the slope. Ronan spared her a glance, just a flicker of something in his eyes before he refocused. More men were coming. They fought like animals, wild and desperate. Ronan moved with the deadly grace of a predator, his tomahawk flashing between gunfire, striking quick and hard. Alice reloaded, fingers shaking. Another outlaw charged from the trees, and she barely had time to react before a shot rang out, missing her by inches. She scrambled back, gripping the rifle too tight. Then she heard a voice, deep, familiar. Well, now ain't this a sight? Her blood went cold. She turned. Thomas Miller stood just beyond the clearing, a pistol in his hand, a cruel smile on his weathered face. "I figured you'd be dead by now," he mused, stepping closer. His eyes flicked to Ronan, who was still, fighting off the last of Grayson's men. "But look at you, playing Outlaw's wife again, are you?" Alice's breath came fast, fury mixing with fear. "What are you doing here?" Thomas chuckled. "I came for what's mine." She gritted her teeth. "I'm not yours." He tilted his head. "You're a girl without a home, Alice. No money. No family." He tusked, shaking his head. "You should be thanking me. I found you another husband, one who won't mind that you've been ruined." She wanted to scream. Her father had sold her once. Now, he was doing it again. Alice's grip tightened around the rifle. "I'd rather die." Thomas sighed. "That's a shame." Then he raised his gun. A shot rang out. For a second, Alice didn't know who had fired. Then Thomas staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. He clutched his chest, fingers slick with blood. "You!" He coughed, sinking to his knees. "You!" Ungrateful little... Another shot. This time he crumpled. Alice's breath came fast, her whole body shaking. The rifle slipped from her hands. Behind her, Ronan stood, smoke curling from his pistol. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something fierce. He stepped toward her, cautious, as if unsure whether she would break. Alice let out a shuddering breath. "He was never my father," she whispered. Ronan nodded, understanding passing between them. The forest was silent now. The outlaws were dead. The danger had passed. Alice felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. Then Ronan reached for her. His hands were rough, calloused, but his touch was steady. She let herself lean into him just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be held without cruelty. "You're free now," he murmured. She swallowed, closing her eyes. "I don't know what that means." His fingers brushed her cheek, a gentle contrast to the violence that had surrounded them. "Then we'll figure it out." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. For the first time in her life, she had a choice. She made it. She took his hand, and together they walked towards something new,